What if I tell you that I can read your mind? You don't believe me? Let's test it. I'm going to be telling you a story and I want you to envision it as clearly as you can. Ready? Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and imagine with me. You wake up with your alarm ringing. You get out of your bed and you check your phone. But wait, it's 7 a.m. Your work starts at 7:30, so you jump out of your bed, brush your teeth, and put on the best clothes you can find. And then, all of a sudden, you stand outside of your house, opening your phone and you order a Grab. You stand outside of your door, anxiously waiting for the driver to arrive, but finally they did. You open the car and you step inside, and then the driver said, "Sorry, buggy," to which you said, "Hi, thank you, but please hurry. I don't want to be late." Unfortunately, there's lots of traffic jams, so you did eventually arrive late. You step inside of your office, but wait, is that your boss? We both entered the same elevator, absolutely terrified and you're sweating like the Pacific Ocean. But thankfully, time seemed to pass on pretty fast. Before you know it, it's time for you to go home. And then, you said goodbye to your secretary, who's waving goodbye at you too. The end. You can open your eyes now. I have several questions for you. First, was your boss a woman? Was your secretary a man? Was your Grab driver Chinese Indonesian? If your answers are no, don't worry. I can't actually read your mind. But what I do know is that each and every one of us here has implicit bias. What is implicit bias? Well, according to the American Psychology Association, implicit bias is defined as the unconscious stereotypes that influence one's decisions, feelings, and behaviors outside of our conscious operations. Basically, it's bias that we can't control. Now, the thing is, every second, our brain processes 11 million bits of information. But out of these, only 400 are processed consciously. So what happens to the rest? Well, the rest are processed automatically by our subconscious mind. However, this subconscious processing is not perfect and is prone to implicit bias. For example, even though you might say that you support women in leadership roles, the way that our environment and society primes us can lead us to believe and associate men and power stronger than women in power. So, my big question is, to what extent and nature does high school educators hold implicit bias towards Chinese Indonesian students in Surabaya? Hypothesizing that there will be a slight negative implicit bias. Basically, educators will hold Chinese students and negative associations closer together. But by now you might be wondering, how can we test something that we're not even consciously aware of? That is where the implicit association test comes in. Developed by Professor Anthony Greenwald and his colleagues, Professor Greenwald suggests that we can measure these subconscious interactions using reaction time. And the idea is actually pretty simple. If you associate two ideas closer together, for example, apples and red, you can connect those two ideas faster than, for example, apple and blue. So, using this, I get to measure my IAT test in over 80 educators in Surabaya, and my IAT test looks something like this. First, participants are told to categorize faces into Indo and Chindo using their keyboard controls E or I, like this. Next, they have to categorize words into positive and negative using the same keyboard controls E or I. Now, these first two blocks are called practice blocks, and participants are given a feedback. For example, sunflower is positive, not? Hence it's incorrect. But here comes the fun part. This is the congruent block. It basically tests the associations, Indo positive and Chindo negative, calculating their reaction time. And the stimuli presented can either be of an image or a word, something like this. Next comes another practice block. This time, if you notice, the categories are flipped, with Chindo on the left and Indo on the right. Now, finally comes the incongruent block. As you can see, the categories for the faces are flipped, just like last time, and this time, the associations being tested are Chindo positive and Indo negative. After you do this test, you will get something that looks like this. Multiply that by over 80 participants and you get a huge load of data. But don't worry, I'll walk you through it. First, since we already gathered our ingredients, we can start cooking. But first, before we be any participants who get over half of the questions wrong, as they might not understand how to do the test, or perhaps they're not focused while doing it. Afterwards, we need to test its significance using the t-test. But what does it mean? Basically, are our results because of implicit bias, or is it just one big coincidence? As you can see here, a p-value less than 0.5 is considered significant, and our test shows a p-value of less than 0.001, meaning yes, our test is significant. Now, let's begin chopping our data. Using my really sharp knife, we can begin calculating the initial mean average reaction time. Remember what I said about when you associate two ideas faster together, it means that you're showing an implicit bias? Well, as you can see here, participants take less time solving the incongruence block correctly, meaning they associate Shindo and positive faster than Shindo and negative, showing that there is a positive implicit bias towards Shindo students. But to what extent, you might ask? That is where my second knife comes in. Calculating the b value, we get a result of 0.187. And interpreting this value, we see that there is a slight positive implicit bias, meaning these educators associate Shindo with positive, slightly stronger than Shindo and negative. By now, you might notice that this result contradicts my initial hypotheses. You might be wondering why. So here is Professor Kurniawan, and according to him, he says that natural exposure reduces bias. So my reason is my participant pool, as the majority of my participants come from international schools. Hence, these students, especially in Turbaya, are more exposed to Shindo students. They're more exposed to diversity and more, which is why it explains the contradiction between my initial hypotheses. So to conclude, even though initially I hypothesized that there would be a slight negative implicit bias, in fact, our findings show that high school educators in Turbaya shows a slight positive implicit bias, meaning that they associate Shindo students and positive. But you might be wondering, what's the point of knowing this? Well, hear me out. Indonesia is a very diverse and multicultural city with over 1,300 different ethnic groups. So, for a very diverse country like us, differences is not something that we can avoid. So our job is not to eliminate all differences. Instead, our job is to work together to build and manage these differences. And only through understanding and acknowledging our implicit biases can we then be more conscious of our thoughts, actions, and behaviors. My name is Angelina. Thank you for listening.